One of my favorite tech buzzwords of recent years has got to be PropTech, the combination of property and technology. And that's largely because the real estate industry is in desperate need of transformation, and what better way to transform than through technology? In today's podcast, we're going to look at how the latest technology trends like Web3, AR, VR, artificial intelligence, and, of course, ChatGPT are impacting the real estate industry, how the Asian PropTech industry differs from other regions of the world, and most importantly, what's next for PropTech. And today, we're lucky enough to be joined by Jordan Kostelac, a seasoned PropTech expert with many years of experience in the real estate and technology industries. Jordan has a proven track record of successfully implementing innovative technology solutions to improve the efficiency, transparency, and profitability of real estate ventures. He is also a sought-after speaker and consultant in the PropTech space and has been featured in numerous industry events and publications. So, without further ado, Jordan, welcome to the TechBurst Asia podcast.
Finally. I generally love listening to the podcast. Every episode I think I've listened to, and I'm excited to get to say my piece one way or the other.
But first thing I want to ask you, what did you think about that intro?
I'm all for any form of flattery. You could punch it up a little bit if you re-record it. Just add a few things about how I've inspired you and all the amazing work I do for children by going nowhere near them.
To be honest with you, I couldn't be asked to write it myself, so I used ChatGPT, and that's the intro it came up with.
It's as robotic as I deserve. I will take it. Thank you both.
I was so impressed. I just typed in your name and I said, I need to introduce Jordan, PropTech expert, for the podcast, and it literally wrote this out for me.
They must be updating because I don't think I was that relevant pre-2021, but we'll see.
Let's get down to business. I mentioned a little bit about PropTech, but for the audience, explain to us, what the hell is PropTech, and is it just another tech buzzword?
I'll start at the end of that question. I think it's devolved into that. The word PropTech was a really useful device, but I think all the portmanteaus of tech are long past time to die, the same way that we don't refer to our phone as a mobile phone. It's no longer novel that it's we don't refer to our TV even as HD, let alone color. Just talk about what you're solving. We don't need to know that it's tech. We need to know the outcomes, not necessarily all the mysticism and arcana of technology that goes into making those outcomes. So yeah, it's a dead term, I think.
I'm actually glad it's dead, because it doesn't mean that people aren't using technology to improve real estate and property. It just means that we don't need the buzzword anymore. People have just gotten on with it. Now I'd like to let the audience find out a little bit more about you, and particularly what you've been doing over the past, 4+ years. So you've been one of the public faces for PropTech in Asia. Can you tell us about what you've been doing in the recent years in this space, and what led you to be called the PropTech Provocateur?
Let's start at the end again. PropTech Provocateur is more about my unending love for alliteration. So I gave myself that moniker, but it was not so much like the LinkedIn positioning of all of that, but more, I felt like a big part of my obligations. And this will get into what I've been doing both market facing and internally when I was at JLL. We have to challenge the accepted conventions of anything if we want to improve. Now, there's a very tight rope to walk between being just disgruntled versus being creatively malcontent, not accepting the status quo, but wanting to constantly explore that there's a better way to do things. Now, I know that technology can do that for real estate, just as you said at the top of the discussion. So it was as much a market-facing moniker that was a call to action to myself, to remind myself my job is to provoke, it was to challenge what is accepted. The sort of functional aspects of my role as the director of PropTech for JLL Asia was first and foremost market facing, evangelizing, spreading the gospel of what we were calling PropTech at the time. To go back to your last question, the definition is the intersection of technology for traditional property processes. But where it gets complex to explore is brokerage a property process or a financial process? And you can argue that it's probably more a financial process just involving property, whereas property management or asset management is actually more of a property, the caretaking of operations of an actual physical asset, a built environment. A lot of it was just going out and speaking at events, doing interviews. I've got a incredibly unflattering picture of a Channel News Asia interview I did years ago where I just looked like a deer in headlights because it was my first big TV appearance. But behind the scenes, what it really looked like was taking the opposition view for our executive board on different technologies and their implications. What my job was to do was to be devil's advocate position and say, yeah, this is a hot technology. Everyone's talking about it, but does it fundamentally move the needle on what we're doing? And sometimes I was wrong, but just having that existing opinion or that opposing opinion was really, I think, a useful way for the leadership at JLL to make better decisions.
But they also need to understand that while the technology might look great and simple to implement, it rarely is. And it involves transferring a bunch of knowledge to people and making sure these processes are adapted to the new way of working. And it's never that easy. It involves getting multiple stakeholders together to understand the business, operational, and financial impact of any new solution. And it always tends to get oversimplified when we try to deliver these things, unfortunately.
Well, I think it regresses to the extremes. The illustrative way I like to say it is about IoT. 99% of PropTech companies I've ever seen they're about output. They're about how to visualize data around all the massive amounts of data that's generated in all the different things that JLL touches. When you ask a lot of these companies, where are you getting the data from? They're usually answers kind of like a shrug, and it's, IoT, like it's magic pixie dust, right? You just sprinkle it on the building and all of a sudden you're getting everything you need. And that's really not the case. So the output layer of the data visualization side is over-serviced, and the actual aggregation of data is really under-serviced in this space. And so that's why I think there needs to be a balancing.
You've also had the chance to not just talk to the people internally at JLL about what you can do with PropTech. You've gotten the chance to work with JLL in a couple of different accelerator type programs where you work with early stage startups and try and help them navigate the complex real estate ecosystem. So can you tell us a bit about those?
Sure. So I was offered the chance to take my most recent position in August or September of 2018. And at that time, JLL had already formed a joint venture to launch what was called Propell Asia, which was a joint venture with Lendlease and was a very early stage accelerator for PropTech startups. And that was out of the fire and into the flames for me. I learned a lot from that process, helping them navigate the complexities of an organization that in Asia is 42,000 people strong, and penetrating big organizations like JLL is already difficult. Navigating it's 10 times more difficult because job titles vary so much. Even what a job title is internally versus externally, you don't really, as an outsider, know where to go. A big part of me was helping them navigate that. I was supposed to be teacher, the professor in all of this, but I was so new to what I was doing. I think I learned as much from the startups as they would have learned from me.
Why don't we look at some examples of who's actually been able to navigate not only the complex ecosystem that is real estate industry, but also the Asia Pacific region. So you've looked at tons of them over the years. Can you give us an example of some that have done really well?
Yeah, and look, I'm going to gloss over the household names, right? Some examples I think that are really relevant to the Asia Pacific market and to addressing those disparate needs I talked about before. I think one really interesting one here in Hong Kong is a company called Negawatt. Negawatt is actually that next lowest hanging fruit if we're going to speak business dork. The residential transactions were the lowest hanging fruit. Energy management was probably the next one up because it ticks that ESG box and it's already being measured. So you got half of that. If it can be measured, it can be managed. So putting these energy management layers on top was a logical next port. But what I think Negawatt is doing that makes the business model successful is they're taking that mysticism out of it and just really appealing to what the landlord's sensibilities are across most of Asia. And I think what Negawatt does really well is they speak to those motivations. This is doing what you need to meet 2020 or 2030 targets, 2025 targets. Here's what you need to be doing. Here's how it will also save you money. But I'm going to give you a couple more examples and then we can move on. Reset is a really interesting one in China. So what Reset is doing, they have a couple of certifications, which are proxies to LEED and WELL. Both of those internationally recognized certifications are a snapshot. So once a year, the body does an inspection and says, yes, you're still certified. What Reset is doing, it's easy to dismiss them as a Chinese knockoff, right? And a lot of people, unfortunately, will do that. But what they're doing that's really interesting is they marry it with a sourcing database for all the materials that go into it, and they marry it with procurement systems and IoT monitoring. So we're not talking about a snapshot once a year, like clean up the restaurant, the health inspector's coming. We're talking about real-time data and then the sort of average of that over the life cycle of the asset. You get a space view that, yes, this building is meeting great environmental standards and great health and wellness standards.
So are they going down through scope 3 emissions through the supply chain as well? The materials they're using? Yeah.
And this is where the myth of just Chinese copycats should really die a quick death, because there's a lot of great innovation happening in China. But it's things like that. When most of the supply chain rested in China, it's the only place you can build that, right? Whereas like Lead and Well, they are incredibly sophisticated bodies and charted a really great course. But just as we demand from our consumer devices, I can look right now and see I took 14,106 steps. And we all expect to be able to know that at a glance. Now, those expectations, I think you'll see an escalation of that for how a building performs in real time. And I think we should all expect that, because one of the things I'm really proud of that we did at JLL, I was lucky enough to be heavily involved in the design process of our Hong Kong office. And that building is LEED Platinum certified. And one of the requirements for LEED Platinum is that the air quality is filtered down to 10 parts per million of 2.5 ppm, the particulate matter in the air. But then an additional filtration system was put in, and it was to always have 1. Occasionally to tick up to 2 on a really hazy day in Hong Kong. Why that matters, I think, is our air quality can get pretty rough here in Hong Kong. And so when people need to choose between working at home or working in the office, when you know that your office is a refuge from poor outdoor air quality that you cannot control in your house, now you have a reason to be there. And I think that's one demonstrable example of the way things are going to change. But companies like Reset are helping us have at a glance or accessible information to that. The last one I'll say, I plug all the time because I'm a non-executive director and advisor to, is this company in Singapore called Geometric. And they're a construction technology company that send QR codes to fabricators and link those QR codes to individual elements on a BIM model. So you can track it essentially the same way you track a parcel, but the BIM model becomes your whole status update for how a project's going. What I think people can take away from that is what we were talking about earlier. Elegant user experience solutions are really what this region needs. And by the way that they've scripted this product is, it doesn't matter if you speak one of the 4 official languages of Singapore or the other 8 that are probably spoken on a construction site in Singapore. You just scan with a smartphone. Doesn't matter. It's just a web-based app, and script runs and updates the next touch point. And that's what technology should be doing. Not adding additional steps, but just letting people harvest data at the touch points they're already doing with the tools that are already in the pocket.
Okay, so we've established that it's a very complex region, a lot of different types of requirements, but there are some great examples where companies are making real impact now. How do you see the market for PropTech evolving in Asia Pacific over the next, let's just say 3 to 5 years? Like, where are the opportunities? What's going to hold us back?
The biggest opportunity lies in ESG. And it's not because of the regulatory hammer that you're starting to see come down. The reason ESG is so much opportunity is because it's a much more existential threat here than it is in places like North America. North America, the things people worry about the most is Miami Beach can disappear. But those same issues of Miami Beach is going to disappear is how much of Singapore will be underwater. Hong Kong is built on so much reclaimed land and so much subterranean parking and things like that. A lot of the core systems of the tallest buildings in Hong Kong rest underground. So if sea levels rise too dramatically, like the cities, they're not wiped out, but they're incredibly crippled. And I think on the other side of that, when you look at a lot of the global discussions, the economies that have benefited from rapid industrialization and things are saying, hey, this is all of our responsibility. But there's a bunch of economies like those that didn't benefit from that rapid industrialization and are expected to be held to the same standard with much less in the way of resources. But in constraint lies opportunity. And I think we're going to see some really cool things. I think we're already seeing some really cool ways of addressing that. One more interesting one that I saw out of Indonesia was bamboo composites that have a tensile strength better than most timber, not quite to steel yet. So you're not going to be building high rises with them, but you can build a lot of buildings with not only a much more sustainably sourced material, but it's not transiting the way that steel does. So we're not also consuming fossil fuels and stuff to transport it.
I want to interrupt you for 1 second because I do agree with you that ESG has it. But the one thing I want to mention is you talked about how the countries that really benefited from the rapid industrialization understand it's their responsibility. I beg to differ on that because there's a couple of them in particular that it just depends on which party's in power. We see what's going on in the US right now where a bunch of the states are coming together saying that you shouldn't be allowed to push ESG type principles. What was it? The one state basically said they're going to ban electric vehicles. Was it Wyoming or something like that? They're going to ban electric vehicles by 2035. I don't know if it was approved or not, but the fact that they're even discussing it makes me want to bang my head. Australia as well, same thing. It just depends on which party is in power, whether or not they're going to be very pro or anti-ESG. There's two places that I watch for innovation related to ESG. It's Europe because they have a centralized directive and everybody follows suit on it and they don't vary. It's a European-wide directive. And I think all buildings have to be net zero by 2030 and public buildings by 2027. Also in China, the fact that they moved their 5-year plan targets from being GDP targets to all ESG targets, that means you're going to align supply, demand, and investment to a country of 1.3, 1.4 billion people, and everyone's going to work on it.
No, I agree. The point I was making there was that when the best of these, we'll say the developed economies, when the best of them say, we're going to do this, they say, oh, everyone needs to do their equal part. But it's not fair to ask Thailand to do the same as the US to say, we're going to make these commitments. I think a great example was a few years ago, like the choice was made in Sri Lanka to go to all organic farming, but that dramatically reduced yield. So it was appealing to its ESG targets, but it didn't serve the people of Sri Lanka.
I was using it as an opportunity to publicly slam Australia and the US for the way they're handling this stuff.
We could just switch the whole conversation to publicly slamming the US and why neither of us ever want to go back.
There you go. Okay, so G is one driver that we see. Are there other drivers or other blockers that we see?
Drivers, I would say the holy grail of PropTech at the moment is a phrase you'll hear over and over again behind closed doors is the CoStar of Asia. But the interesting thing is CoStar. So for those not familiar, CoStar is essentially the largest sort of source of truth for real estate transaction data in the US. They're also notoriously litigious. In fact, don't put that part in because they might sue me. CoStar does have almost a monopolistic position on data in the US around real estate transactions. And that's, I think, what a lot of people are chasing. But again, that's the IO paradox rearing its ugly head. Everyone wants to make the output, but nobody wants to get their hands dirty and figure out how to make the input work.
Let's take a look at some of the blockers. So right now we've got a downturn in the economy. Does that mean people are going to spend less on technology, or does it mean they should be spending more to start driving the PropTech solutions?
I don't think it's that. There needs to be more M&A in the PropTech space so that solutions as presented are more holistic. I'll give you a really good example that's super recent. You've probably seen this, your audience may not. We'll put a link in here, but there's a new AI algorithm that just detects changes in the frequency of response for Wi-Fi routers that can essentially map the entire environment that the Wi-Fi is covered. So instead of having a whole array of sensors to detect how many people are in the space, you can literally just put an algorithm into your Wi-Fi router to monitor these things. That's the kind of stuff where you have an elegant and arguably low-cost solution versus deploying a bunch of sensors that require maintenance, they require the CapEx, they require then a subscription, and they really only do one thing. So everyone was always fighting over unnatural monopolies or control of the space. And this is, I think, last generation Silicon Valley thinking that it's starting to be really moved away from quickly, but that winner takes all or winner takes most approach, I think what you're going to see is not consolidation of companies that are building similar things, but offering a more holistic package that addresses larger themes in the property world. So whether it's operational efficiency, it's ESG needs, I think you're going to see more PropTech bundled in a way that addresses the disease instead of the symptoms.
I like that you brought up the idea about the M&A, because I always try to figure out who should be leading in the spaces. And so when you look at something like PropTech, is it the technology vendors? Is it the building management system vendors, the commercial real estate firms? You worked for JLL. They famously have their own JLLT or JLL technology arm that has a lot of different technologies in there, whether they're united enough into a good common vision. We'll leave that for a different podcast. Or is it systems integrators? Who do you think should be leading the way? Or is it more of just an ecosystem play and we all need to work together to drive the market?
I think we all need to work together, but I think you and I are pragmatic enough to know
that's not happening.
Yeah. Look, there was a really great quote from one of the partners at Fifth Wall, which is a big PropTech venture capital fund. They said, and it was around ESG, but I think it's really applicable to everything, is I trust people's realistic reasons or moralistic reasons for tackling ESG, but I trust their capitalistic reasons more. We don't really have to look far to find examples of how M&A can and should work, because we've already seen this in other sectors. The AI arms race, which I know we'll talk about soon, again, that is not, I think we're moving away from a winner takes most or winner takes all. And people are getting better and better with technology and bundling. I think you'll see more systems integrators types of approach for PropTech, where they're coming over the top and saying, look, we will build a solution that tackles some of those big challenges. You want your building to be energy compliant? Good. We'll put together a PropTech package, just like we have phone packages, right?
You talked a little bit about artificial intelligence. And before we go into the specific technologies, all these things that we're putting in our buildings right now, they're all capturing data. And that data hopefully is secured. But are we really securing these things now? So what challenges do PropTech companies or real estate firms face when it comes to data privacy and security? If we're using video analytics, if we're just capturing sensors from around our building and all the different equipment, what are the risks and are we really addressing them yet?
Well, first and foremost, cybersecurity. So, and in all sincerity, I don't miss an episode of this podcast. There's only 3 others that I don't ever miss an episode of. And one of them is a podcast called The Darknet Diaries. It sounds scarier than it is, and some episodes are extremely tough to get to. But for the most part, what that podcast touches on is cybersecurity and just the absolutely ridiculous ways in which information systems are penetrated. And it's usually through some really dumb stuff. You can point to some, doing air quotes now, with some PropTech examples that are infamous. Target's huge data hack, I think in like 2015 or 14, something like that, was done through a thermostat on an HVAC system in one of the stores. Very famously, a casino in Las Vegas, their high roller database was kept through a temperature sensor in an aquarium in the lobby of the casino. And look, that's incredibly sophisticated penetration, but there's other ways people fall backwards into stuff. So I think that's number one. Firms should not think just because you're dealing in hard assets that cybersecurity is not a big concern and should remain a concern. Privacy is a really weird thing because people value privacy only when it's been extremely violated. But when you talk about systems like machine vision and monitoring, so one of the companies that I mentored in our Propell Asia program at JLL was a company called Loretta.ai, and they do machine vision monitoring, all kinds of things. And what's so cool about what they do is the same way Amazon can monitor your behavior on a web page, so too can they monitor consumer behavior in retail environments. Like, hey, last month, Dolce & Gabbana, a lot more people slowed down in front of your store. You had probably more effective merchandising last month than you do this month. And there's evidence to support that. Those technologies, they start off very scary and dystopian, but a lot of times now they use a system called Avatar, which instead of recognizing your face as Charles Anderson and my face as Jordan Kostelac, But every point that my face is profiled, it's just saying, this is the same case, this is the same case. And it will, somewhat dystopian. And what's the Tom Cruise movie?
Was it Minority Report?
Yeah, in Minority Report, where it's standing and then serving about, our lives are already pretty close to that. And systems, they use machine vision. I remember you at a conference once, and I think you profiled you as being like either much older or much younger. And these systems, they don't quite get it right, but they're not identifying. And I think people are already accepting of that.
What you're talking about was something that happened to me. It's happened to me twice, once in Taiwan and then once in an event in Barcelona, but it was a Singaporean company. And the idea is that when you use visual analytics, it's basically only as good as the inputs that go in there. So when I was at Taiwan at one of the big smart city events there, you could walk by and the screen would basically profile you. You're a male, what race you are, and your approximate age. But because it's a Taiwanese company, that means that 95% of the inputs that it would be learning from are going to be of Asian men or women. I mean, I come in there as a white guy. And I remember I must have been 45 at the time, and it came in and said I was a mid-60s white male. And the same thing happened to me in Barcelona. And I was giving the company grief because I know some of the people. And I'm like, seriously, you guys got to start using some photos of white people. But then if I go back to the US, it would be very accurate, probably looking at someone like me. And it wouldn't be that good at monitoring the Asians. So it's garbage in, garbage out. If you don't put in good inputs, you're not going to have good visual analytics.
Yeah. And there's a really good documentary on Netflix about how those sort of identification algorithms and profiling algorithms are really skewed away from people of color and women in the US. And these are real ethical problems that need to be solved before we declare these technologies acceptable. Well, I guess to my other point on this answer is people don't really care until it's an egregious violation. And that's a shame. And that's why I'd say looking at things like the Darker Diary, because it's really interesting the novel and creative ways that people are able to penetrate systems or violate privacy.
But it's an amazing thing that we say we were concerned about data privacy, but we never really do anything about it. It's like we put all of our data out there in platforms like Facebook or on Instagram, and that information's just out there forever. And with visual analytics, we're capturing this information. Occasionally there's a backlash. That's what I like Australia for, because there's always good backlashes there. And they had one where the city of Darwin got in a bit of trouble because they were using visual analytics and didn't have governance regulations about how the data would be ethically used and disposed of. So they did pull that together, and I think it was great. They worked with Singapore's IMDA to actually create that program. And this is what we need more of. We need almost like public-private partnerships to come together with citizens' rights groups and say, this is what the acceptable and ethical use of the data that you capture is. But right now, it's just a free-for-all. And what is it? Even in the US, the police are using Ring cameras to track people. It's just it's absolutely bizarre.
Tapping the Ring cam. Yeah. So I think this is where I think there's a few things that I absolutely have to change. And maybe I can get the AI discussion that will help solve some of it. But living conditions are far too complex for anyone to know what they're signing up for. And it's so hard to buy a device these days as a consumer. It doesn't have some sort of subscription model, or at least that I need to create a login. But I would say the broader thing with a post-internet culture, post-social media culture is that FOMO is a hell of a drug, right? I was speaking to my aunt the other day, and she's like, I only don't get rid of Facebook because this is the way I keep up with everybody's lives. I was like, I'm on Facebook and you're calling me. Well, we had the answers, but the tyranny of convenience that sort of keeps us locked into these things. Look, the public consciousness is on that. You see more and more people moving away from that, especially younger people. They're just better wired. They're more acutely aware of how much of their privacy they're giving up.
Well, hopefully people keep being aware of it, because we need to figure out where we go from here, because it's only going to get worse with the way that artificial intelligence is advancing. And maybe this is a good segue to that. What are some of the ways that beyond just visual analytics that AI is starting to impact the PropTech industry in Asia Pacific?
I don't think we've seen a huge impact of AI in Asia yet for PropTech. There, I would say the most common use case is the one that we have discussed. That's machine vision. So there's the public acknowledgement of these foundational AIs that are out now. So the underlying language models that have given rise to DALL-E and to ChatGPT and now Bard. But there's a lot of AI that's existed and solved some really elegant problems. Actually, one of Google's earliest AIs was tuning how the airflow and the cooling systems worked in their data centers. And they were able to reduce, just by algorithmically monitoring that and adjusting it in real time, they were able to reduce that energy expenditure and the subsequent cost by 40%. It's not a guy turning the dial, gets a little too hot in the room. It's a system monitoring and keeping it better balanced. But I wouldn't liken that to the kind of AI that's sort of grabbing the headlines at the moment. But that's, again, I think it's at first port, right? It's the easiest place to plug in some of these technologies where it's already being measured and has been measured for decades. It's things like energy and climate management. There's something to be said about the power of active voice when communicating. And I think that's ChatGPT's superpower at the moment, is that it comes off as certain even when it's probably incorrect. So let's look at two really somewhat recent examples. When you look at the creator economy that has emerged out of YouTube, or let's say podcasting, if that's a little closer to home, or live stream, the production quality of this podcast is fantastic. Like, it's better than any audio experience I've had up until a couple of years ago. And so there is a collective rising tide that happens around these technologies. I've worked in like product manager capacities in the past, and I use Notion's embedded GPT modules to do all of my PRD documentation for this new project I'm working on. What I love about these LLMs or large language models that are powering these things is it never gets it right the first time. I think the sort of phenomenon is called Gilman amnesia, the idea that you can read a newspaper article that's categorically wrong because you're a domain expert in that subject. You know it's wrong, but then you turn the page to the next article on a different subject and you accept it as the truth because it's in the newspaper. ChatGPT is very subject to that at the moment. The power of GPT is to mansplain back to it how it's wrong. And in the process of mansplaining that, just like when you teach a young child something that you know but don't know well, you feel a little better equipped after you break it down and explain it to them. Same thing is true for this, where the output after the conversation is a pretty fully realized document. Writing technical documentation sucks. Editing technical documentation, pretty gratifying process. And so I think it's really just equipping people for better tools, but I'm personally very excited by it. And if the singularity comes, well, how much I could have done about it in the first place.
I agree with you on this one. And the thing is, I like that we constantly have new things coming out that just make old things not necessary anymore. I always go back and tell the story about when I went to university because I studied finance and economics. And I used to have to memorize formulas. That's how old I am. Like NPV, IRR. I had to memorize the formulas, and we were allowed to bring in a simple calculator to then calculate it out during the exams. Then suddenly you had Lotus 1, 2, 3 in Excel, and suddenly why would anybody ever memorize that formula?
Yeah, like I hate all militaristic sort of metaphors that get used in this case, but we are talking technological arms races. Is Google or Apple versus Android? It leads to better outcomes. And I think these different AIs competing against human creativity is a really exciting time. With the PRD stuff and a lot of the documentation I've been doing, I had really done 2 weeks worth of work in 4 days in some cases. And I'm very new at using these tools, and there's more of them coming up every day. We're now able to play a symphony with one musician because of these things. And I think that's just incredibly exciting.
Well, it's going to be a fun thing to watch because this is also the early iterations of these LLPs. And you can only imagine what they're going to be in 6 or 12 months from now, once they have a little bit of practice. Like you said, Google just launched theirs in the last 2 days. You've got ChatGPT. There's going to be others popping up. And you've already mentioned DALL-E. I think it's really exciting to see how it will change. And it's going to rip up some old job processes that we used to do and just throw them away because we'll never need it again. But that means that those people who do those have to find ways to always adapt. We've talked enough about artificial intelligence now. So let's segue into one of my other favorite buzzwords, which I really actually hate, which is the metaverse. So how do you anticipate that this will impact the real estate industry going forward, or will it even? And more importantly, will I have legs?
You will not have legs. Anybody who's ever played any video game knows that legs, the human gait is incredibly sophisticated, so much so that it's actually more unique than a fingerprint. China uses gait recognition technology as a more accurate classifier than even facial recognition technology, which is crazy. So no, you probably won't get legs anytime soon. But we started the conversation talking about how PropTech was a useful device. I would argue that Web3 and metaverse aren't even useful as devices because they're so broad and so shallow of terms that they seem to mean anything and everything. And even the biggest players in the world, in terms of like some of the consulting firms that have put out publications on this, they've used that abstraction and sort of damn lies and statistics to create this hype around the internet. I mean, you and I were around for when we were logging on the information superhighway or venturing into cyberspace. If you said any of that now, you wouldn't be on a tech podcast. And I think that some PR smoke and mirrors from one of the big internet companies should not be a whole new technology sector made. And look, meta and verse, just parse that in the English language, and you are literally talking about two terms that mean large abstraction. And then Web3, I think, is slightly better defined. Now, having said that about both of these terms, is more of the internet and more of electronic commerce going to be powered by blockchain and cryptocurrency? Yeah, I believe that. Are we going to be using mixed reality platforms more in the future than we do today? Yes. But I think imminence is not urgence, right? I think a really good example that I can illustrate in an audio format is when I go to a grocery store, I get frustrated because even if it's the same chain of grocery stores, when I go to a different location, everything's in a different place because not all store physical designs are alike. So the merchandising is always different. When I shop online, I just type in what I want and go to it. So oftentimes in these quote unquote metaverse environments, you're synthesizing the worst experiences, not the parts that make whatever the internet does, the convenience of the internet, so useful. So why would I want to wander around a merchandised shelf style metaverse space when I can just type in, I want green beans, right? I don't have to type the I want. I just put green beans and it tells me all the green bean options. I'm right there to the shelf instantly, as opposed to navigating the clumsy and low fidelity graphic environment. Yes, these technologies will have a role to play in our future, but again, they're not urgent. What I think people racing to sort of capture lightning in the bottle or the next big thing miss in these conversations is they don't take the time to decide if they enjoy it themselves. They're too concerned about getting it fast enough to get it into someone else's hands. And that's what's really beleaguered the metaverse and crypto, and to a lesser extent, blockchain discussion.
I do look forward to see what the metaverse will be in the future, because while I do mock it quite a bit, that's just because I think it's such an early stage. And I made the comment about the legs. I don't care if there's legs. I just don't think there should be gravity. Like, why do we try to recreate what we have in the physical world into the metaverse? It's absolutely pointless. And I took a look at what Accenture's using, because they're onboarding 150,000 people this year. In the first day, they do it in the metaverse. And I love hearing the horror stories about how you get people who are getting almost like seasick from the movements on it. You have people who are like the issues with battery life. As soon as you take it off, it has problems reconnecting. And it's not a fluid experience. But then I've looked at the screens inside. They literally created an office building, made you look at a PowerPoint screen, and made you queue. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. This is what would make me hate my first day at a big company. And they've tried to recreate it in the metaverse, which hopefully we'll learn from it and move on, but we'll have to see.
I just want to share one of my favorite ones, because it says we're tapping on the same examples here. If all you're doing is synthesizing the same experience, you're not asking yourself, is this a good or bad experience? I saw a similar large bank had done a similar type of seminar in a metaverse realm. And the funniest thing to me was they had chairs that people could sit in. And even in the virtual environment, people would not sit in like the first 3 rows. It's such a weird compulsion. No one ever sits in the front rows of presentations, but it's even stranger that they wouldn't do that in a realm where you're really not concerned with personal space, right?
You did mention a bit about Web3 and blockchain. And I think it's time that we actually talk a little bit about what you're doing now, because you are no longer with JLL. And I know we're going to do a podcast in the future once this new venture is a little bit more developed. But why don't you tell us what you're looking to do, which combines a blockchain-based platform related to PropTech and venture capital? You've put a lot of buzzwords in one description there. So tell us, what are you looking to do, why it's necessary, and how you think you can disrupt the industry?
Sure. I've had to read a lot about blockchain for a long time, but as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes the people selling the technology want to mystify it. They manufacture complexity where it need not be, thinking that makes them the gatekeeper and helps entrench their moat. And so I didn't really understand blockchain for a long time while I talked about it. And then one of my friends asked me to get a MetaMask wallet so I could play Dungeons and Dragons with him using smart contracts. And it's like that scene in The Hangover when like he starts to compute and like card counts, like it's just all these equations going off in my head. It was a eureka moment that, okay, really all this is an append-only database that adds data through if this then that statements. That's all blockchain and smart contracts are. The only big difference is most blockchains, what we think of as blockchain, or at least some of the information is publicly available. The company is called Deploy. Our website is deploycapital.online. What it is meant to be is a decentralized scout network. And so why we say decentralized is most scout networks are affiliated with one particular fund, and they have very limited reach. They have the reach of their network. But what I've witnessed sitting on both sides of the table for a lot of venture investment is that deals are often originated through social connections, not through domain expertise. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think there's a better way to get domain experts involved in the front of the process of sourcing deals. This is not a model that doesn't exist in other industries. You have this with A&R and street teams in the music industry. For the younger listeners, it used to be physical albums and radios and things. They used to make money outside of Spotify, but they really mobilizing ground game. What our system does is it takes reputation management and some scarcity of your ability to submit deals. The idea is someone like yourself, someone like me, who is really intellectually curious around particular domains and out there all the time meeting new startups. When we see one we believe in, if we work for a big company, as I did until recently, and they say, no, we're not interested, we have another vehicle to put that through and possibly reap the benefits. What I like to say is we're converting social capital into real capital. So we're referring those startups we believe in to alternate investors. In the past, I've actually invested in companies after JLL has exercised their first rights of refusal. But I think that by doing this, by creating a system that really casts a wide net, because you can create a huge network of scouts by a decentralized platform, and then you run it through the funnel of a smaller group of domain experts to give it preliminary due diligence and a blind consensus model. The outcome is that smaller funds can compete with bigger funds in terms of the deals they get visibility on at a fraction of the cost of a traditional scout network. And I think there's a lot of domain experts that get worked out of the equation for one reason or the other. And this is where blockchain will provide a better body of evidence than we've had available to us in the past about who is contributing at what points of the deal flow chain of custody.
I like the concept. I look at some of the challenges you're going to face. So I'm really curious to see how it plays out. But obviously, you can come back on once it's ready to go and explain a little bit more about it. But now what I want to do is go out to some closing questions, more rapid fire, and let's have some fun with this one. So let's start off with this. Let's look out 5 years into the future. And let's say that PropTech has taken off in Asia. What do you think would have happened that led to this success?
Look, everyone likes to define this as the iPhone moment. There's not going to be an iPhone moment because the consumer expectations of buildings are keep me comfortable, keep me dry, be pretty clean, and that's about it. I think what's going to happen is they're going to be bundled up more neatly so that they're addressing the B and C grade assets. They're going to be addressing what makes them competitive or what helps to enhance them for the best value. And I think in A grade assets, it's going to be more of a customer focused model. They're going to have more of a hospitality model. It's the big fish still run this pond. Some of the big players will take the lead. You're already seeing this with things like Wired Score is an interesting PropTech company. You're seeing a bit of an arms race around Wired Score. A lot of people, just as they want to be LEED certified a few years ago, now want to be Wired Score certified so that they can tell their tenants, yes, you can challenge this.
Mental note, I should make up a new platform for this where I can actually do my own ratings agency. It's a good way to make money, I think. So what if tech bombs? What would we as an industry have totally screwed up?
Look, I think it's the same old song dance. There's nothing wrong with making a $500 million company as an entrepreneur. Right? If we allow for wild, uncontrolled growth and the same kind of weaponization of capital that we've seen in the last generation of startups, especially if we're talking about property, the cautionary tale of WeWork, that's what's going to make it bomb. Weaponized capital and just not delivering a fundamentally good product early enough, but rather just trying to take the whole pie and then realizing there's no pie left to be had.
We've known each other for many years. So tell me something about yourself that I don't know that's going to surprise me.
I think the one that surprises most people is I'm a real softy cat dad. For those who haven't seen me, you'll see the picture. I'm covered in tattoos.
Tattoos of cats.
So we've lost a couple of cats over the last couple of years, and when each of them have gone, I've gotten a memorial tattoo. And yeah, when my girlfriend and I first decided to live together, she said, I hope you're okay living with cats. And I shrugged it off and said, I'm more of a dog person. I don't really like cats. But it didn't take long before I just became a sucker. One is not enough. We're actively looking to get one or two more. I'm a crazy cat lady now.
So final question, how can our guests get in touch with you, either via social or a website, or to find out more information about your new venture, or just follow your insights and the PropTech industry?
Yeah, so my name is difficult to spell. I'm the only Jordan Kostelac in the world that I'm aware of. So jordankostelac.net is my link tree, if you will. On Twitter, I'm Stooplessness, which is a joke going back to my project management days. All of that's on LinkedIn. You and I talk a lot on LinkedIn. So if you're following Charles, you've probably seen a few of my posts as well. If what I've said has tickled your fancy, please reach out. I'd love to talk to you more about it and see how we could get you involved.
Well, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us about your views on the industry and also giving us an update on what you're going to be doing next. And I hope you'll be willing to come back onto the Techburst Asia podcast and talk about it in more detail next time.
Charles, thank you so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Techburst Asia podcast. If you liked the episode, please do click like and subscribe. And if you didn't, well, you probably didn't make it this far anyway. Talk to you next time on the next episode of the Techburst Asia podcast.